given the torrential rain outside, we were nervous whether we'd be able to start on time. And if and when we started, we would be any more than the speakers. And so we're most impressed. It gives me great pleasure on behalf of Institute of Chinese Studies and India International Center to welcome the distinguished scholars from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. You have actually the bio in front of you, or maybe not everybody. I shall just briefly, rapidly go through. First of all, the program would be, we have first Kristy Tsun-Tzu Hsu, who will open the proceedings. I'm wearing two hats under instructions from my director. I chair the proceedings and I'm making the presentation on the Indian side. And then we are going to have, I'm told the order has been changed, and Ms. Bonnie Glase will proceed, Ambassador Derek Mitchel. Now, so our first speaker, and Kristy, is precisely the ideal subject for opening the day's proceedings. She, in fact, as you will see in the program, will tell us about the new Southbound Policy. She knows India well. She's been in and out of India. She's co-authored and authored a book on India-Taiwan economic relations. She's director of Taiwan ASEAN Studies Center, Tsinghua Institution for Economic Research in Taiwan. And she advises on Taiwanese government's Asian, in particular Southeast Asian and Indian policy, including the NSP. And so I have a great pleasure in inviting, they're insisting that I call them by their first names, so Kristy will open the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kristy, and I'm very honored and privileged to give an introductory presentation of the new Southbound Policy and introduce you a bit of Taiwan-India economic relations. And for some of you who have never heard the new Southbound Policy, this is the government's official portal. Please go to the portal and find information that I will not be able to cover today. And the new Southbound Policy was announced by President Tsai Ing-wen when she took office in May 2016. The policy has entered into full implementation since January last year, and as the government's most important external economic strategy, as well as approaches to participate in regional economic integration. The policy has an objective of fostering regional prosperity and development. And the new Southbound Policy seeks to explore and expand cooperation with 18 countries in areas of trade and investment, and also collaboration, people-to-people exchanges, and also resource sharing and institutional links, while showcasing Taiwan's soft power as well as shared economic development experiences. And among these 18 countries, 10 are Southeast Asian countries. 6 are South Asian countries with India as the leader. And during the policy design and also the response from Taiwan's business community, the policy right now currently prioritizes 6 countries, which are Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and of course India. And 4 potential partners also emerged. One is Singapore, and the other 3 are emerging economies, which are Cambodia, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. You may not know that in the past years, Taiwan investment have gone to Bangladesh and building up footwear as well as textile and garment clusters in that countries. So the policy is not new of its kind. In previous years, for example, starting in 1994, the government has adopted the action plans for enhancing economic relations with Southeast Asia, and that was known as the beginning of Taiwan's government's Go South policy and actions. And there were 3 waves of Go South, and two of these waves were adopted by President Li Denghui and one by President Chen Shui-bian. The common characteristics of these 3 waves policy were top-down and also government-driven. And the main respondents were state-owned companies, for example, the political party-owned, the Kuomintang-owned enterprises, and also large companies. And the policy has encountered a lot of difficulties. For example, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, for example, and also the anti-Chinese riots in 1998 in Indonesia. And not to mention that China increased to open up its market. However, despite of these difficulties, Taiwan has built manufacturing clusters in Southeast Asia and established comprehensive Taishang, means Taiwanese business or Taiwanese companies networks in Southeast Asian countries. And since 2009, we have witnessed a new trend of Taiwanese business returning to South Asia. And based on this new trend, the new Southbound policy adopted by President Tsai was more market-driven and based on keen interests of Taiwan business people in ASEAN economic community, and also concerns of exclusion from regional integration and dependence on China. You may have heard the term rise of red supply chain, meaning that Chinese wants to develop its own supply chain, replacing Taiwanese company and other foreign companies. So this exactly explains what China plans to do under its Making China 2025 plan. And therefore, this new Southbound policy based on these facts and also expand from traditional trade and investment to go further. Services, new economy, green economy, and also smart economy, and also builds on institutional dialogues and also people-to-people exchanges. So the policy has been there for 1 year, and according to the first year assessment, and the bilateral trade, the total trade with new Southbound policy countries amounted to $111 billion. And a lot of efforts were aimed at changing trade structures because 80% of the trade between Taiwan and these countries were trade by intermediate goods. And in last year, exports to these countries counted for more than 20% of Taiwan's total export, and import accounts for around 16% of Taiwan's total import. However, compared with China, which is Taiwan's largest exporting markets as well as largest import source, Taiwan's dependence on China is still very high, and we still need to work harder. In terms of foreign direct investment, approximately 10,000 Taiwanese companies have investment in new Southbound policy countries up to $100 billion, and they are creating up to 4 million jobs in past 2 decades. In Vietnam alone, Taiwanese company has created more than 1.5 million jobs. And after 30 years of development there, now most of Taishang have developed into their second generation's operation. And in terms of people-to-people exchange, when we mention the tourism, last year the total number of inbound tourist arrivals from these countries reached 2.3 million, ranking the second largest source next to China. And China today is still our largest source of tourist arrival. However, you may all know that the tourist arrival from China has been very, very volatile because, for example, the government, Chinese government took a hard stance on Thai's government, and then a lot of tourists stopped coming to Taiwan. And with relations to education, last year we have more than 30,000 students from this country studying Taiwan, and also we have more and more students going to these countries trying to know better of our neighbors. There are a number of flagship programs, and also the recent. There are quite some recent development. For example, the agriculture has been one of the flagship programs. For example, under this policy, the government aims to establish agriculture demonstration parks in some of the countries. This includes India, for example, and Indonesia, for example. And for public health, which is also one important area of bilateral collaboration. And we have been, for example, discussing programs together with the United States under the United States Global Cooperation and Training Framework. We believe that this kind of joint programs with the U.S. can be extended from not only in Southeast Asian countries, but also to India and other areas. And industry innovation is another flagship program, and under this, Taiwan aims to build a partnership with this country in establishing global value chain and also helping to create more higher value-added industry. For example, there are a number of sectors that have been identified. For example, in Thai, the focus will be on auto parts, Philippines on medical equipment, and for India, it's ICT, smartphone, and notebook manufacturing. And later I'll talk about the new trend that Chinese companies are coming to India for that purpose. And for industrial talent and entrepreneurship development, and the government is reviewing, for example, working visa applications and also cooperation in vocational school. Our ambassador's vision is to build vocational training centers in India, in different states, and that are willing to work with Taiwan in terms of cultivating young talents in industry. And also encouraging the NGOs and young leaders exchange, and also Taiwan-style ODA program. For this, Taiwan aims to provide, together with other countries, other like-minded country, high-quality infrastructure, which includes ICT, new energy, environmental facilities, and smart cities. So it's different from other countries who provide large-scale infrastructure. And also for tourism, and the government will continue to review visa treatment to new Southbound Policy countries, and also to promote halal tourism and Muslim-friendly tourism at home. And these are the data in the past years. These are the visitor arrivals from some ASEAN countries and India. So as shown in the table, you can see that we have, for example, more than half a million tourists from Malaysia, and also a lot from Vietnam. But from India, we have only around 30,000 tourists from India, and we have also less tourists going to this country. So this can be an area that we can work closely in the future. And these are the foreign students from the main New Southbound Policy states. And on the very top, it's Malaysia. Because of its Chinese speaking population. So we have Malaysia as the largest sending countries. And India, again, though the number is not much, and we have only around 1,500 students last year, but the growth rate has been very, very significant. And in terms of foreign professionals from these countries, and some of you may know that 4 years ago, in Taiwan, we started Indian programs hosted by a Taiwanese company, and they invite their employees and their technicians in India to study in Taiwan and Taiwan's technical colleges. And currently, India has the second largest number of professionals, only next to Malaysia and Taiwan. Last year, we have also around 1,500 professionals working in Taiwan. Most of them work in Science Park, and also in other high technology areas. So I'll talk a bit about Taiwan-Indian trade and investment relations. The bilateral trade hit the peak in 2011, around $7.5 billion US. However, since that, bilateral trade has been decreased, but recently we found that the trade has picked up growth momentum under the new Southbound Policy. And the trade structure between Taiwan and India has been highly complementary and concentrated. For example, India imports high-value technology products from Taiwan for industrial use and export mineral fuels, organic chemicals, carton, gems, and jewelry to Taiwan. However, this trade structure is very much different from Taiwan trade with China and also Southeast Asian countries, where mostly intermediate goods have been traded to support Taiwan invested production facilities in this country. And as for FDI, it has slow growth of FDI, Taiwan's FDI in this country. If we compare the FDI with Vietnam, our FDI in India only accounts for 2.5% of our total FDI in Vietnam. And this has been happened because of the lack of support industry here, and also high import duties, and also complicated tax and legal systems. And if we include indirect investment by Taiwanese company, the total investment exceeds $1.5 billion US. However, our investment in Vietnam totaled $60 billion US. So this is something that we can work hard, okay? And therefore, 4 years ago, we conclude a feasibility study of establishing a Taiwan-Indian economic cooperation agreement with our counterpart in Korea. And with that end, we hope that we can continue to discuss the possibility of setting up a bilateral trade agreement between Taiwan and India. And I want to tell you that in recent years we have seen significant new trends coming. The Taiwanese company have enthusiastically responded to Prime Minister Modi's Making India initiative, and by relocating and also expanding manufacturing facilities to India. The Taiwanese company are now building, for example, the notebook computers, smartphone manufacturing clusters in India. This is something never happened before. And for example, in India, the year 2015, India imported smartphones worth $5 billion US from China, 80% of which from China, and India imported parts of smartphone worth of $3.2 billion from China, again 42% from China. With Taiwan coming to set up in collaboration with Indian partners, emerging, for example, clusters for notebook and also for smartphone, we believe that this cluster can satisfy the local market as well as decrease imports and also your dependence from Chinese imports. And there are other potential sectors, including the including the automobile parts, tires, textile and garments, and also petrochemical and biotechnology. And currently, the Taiwanese company are adjusting global investment strategy to respond to global trade protectionism and American first policy. And we believe that a lot of Taiwanese companies may consider India as their next destination for their global strategy. So these are the some of the famous names of Taiwanese company here. This includes the world's largest contract manufacturer in electronic industry. Foxconn, for example, Foxconn, Wistron, Inventec, and Compo. These are the world's 4 largest contract manufacturers. They have either set up their R&D centers or factories in India, and they have starting assembling, for example, the iPhone here, and they have big plans in the future. And for notebooks, we have ASUS and HTC. They also outsource their manufacturing activities here to Taiwanese companies. So this is for the first time that in India there is an emerging Taiwan-centered notebook as well as smartphone clusters. And these are some of the news. And so this is the phones produced by a Taiwanese company, and this picture shows that one of our companies, the MediaTek, organized a high-level training programs in Taiwan, inviting more than 100 of your very senior engineers to Taiwan for 6 weeks training. So the companies is doing these programs in Taiwan so as to co-develop a human resource in these sectors with India. Okay. So the way forward, as China becomes more targeted by trade remedies and sanctions, and the Chinese is determined to have stronger support of its national industry, we believe Southeast Asian countries and India are emerging as new centers of manufacturing clusters and supply chain. India can be home to emerging clusters of electronics, smartphone, iPad, notebook, computers, auto parts, high-tech, textile, and can encounter Making China 2025 in partnership with Taiwan and Taisang networks across the region, including our networks in Vietnam, and also our networks in Myanmar, and also our networks in Bangladesh, for example. And last week, Taiwan's 2 science park authorities have signed MOU with Khanna to share Taiwan's experiences of developing industrial park and cluster, and this can be a milestone for bilateral collaboration. And one of our largest developer, the TECO Group, 2 days ago have held a groundbreaking ceremony to invest $100 million to build Taiwan Technology Innovation International Park. This is probably the first kind of Taiwan Science Park, Taiwan High Technology Park in this country. And we heard that another state, Hyderabad state government, proposed to jointly invest with this company in building another industrial park. So this shows that current situation, Taiwan and India may find new direction for enhanced partnership, not only under the new Southbound Policy, but for enhancing bilateral economic partnership to face this changing dynamics of the international. With this, I'll conclude the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristy, for this very detailed presentation, both of the outline of the NSP program and of India-Taiwan economic relations. You have made my job much easier. I mean, you have sort of, at least more than 50% of what I would have said has been said, with much greater authority and much greater detailed study of the subject. I need hardly say that having left the government many years ago, I speak only in my personal capacity. Relevant to this subject, a particular experience, all right, first one would say perhaps a little point in terms of how these trilateral relations, India, Taiwan, and PRC, which were at one stage, people were very worried as to how this could be worked out. But many countries have found a formula whereby, whilst diplomatic relations are exclusively with PRC, relations in a wide range of other fields can be conducted with Taiwan. And it was on that basis that I was asked in '95 to go and open India's office in Taiwan. And this is part of the then Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao's Look East policy. Look East, looking Act East, and so on. We're very good at these slogans. Anyway, now a little footnote there. A few months before I was asked to go there, a high-level individual, sort of non-official delegation went to Taiwan. It was led by Mr. I.K. Gujral, who went on to become, as you know, India's Prime Minister. They were very kindly received by the then President of Taiwan, President Lee Teng-hui, who spoke at some length to them about what Kristy has mentioned, what preceded the NSP, is Go South policy. And he said that about, and he emphasized his keenness to divert Taiwanese investments away from PRC, and he felt that India would be a very attractive destination. You must remember at that time, Taiwan had the most formidable foreign exchange reserve, that is the talk around the world. So I arrived in Taiwan with high hopes, but within months I discovered that really while this policy relating to Vice President Lee Teng-hui was perfectly genuine about his Go South policy, the decision in terms of direction of investments was primarily in the hands of private business and not really in the hands of the government. And so it was an uphill task, and in fact the figures as shown, we are still climbing. Of course, there were also various considerations which Taiwanese businessmen had about difficulties of doing business in India. Some of these Kristy has highlighted. Many of them have since that time been resolved. When I arrived there, it was practically, more or less impossible for Taiwanese firms to conduct business in India. And I think steadily many of the problems are being resolved. Innovative formulae are found to get around the kind of political problems and other problems which sometimes stand in the way of Taiwanese business in India. And naturally, as far as I could imagine, that India would always be would most welcome Taiwanese trade, business, and investment. Kristy has given the figures. At one level, if you were to take only India-Taiwan figures without comparing them with anything else, they are quite impressive. Trade has gone up from about 1 billion. In fact, when I left Taiwan, my real goal was, $1 billion India-Taiwan trade. Today is, we said once it went up to 7, it's come down to say 6.5 billion or so. But of course, when you compare this with Taiwan's trade with PRC, it's minuscule. And even in relation to other NSP countries, it is not impressive at all. But it seems to be growing steadily. Similarly, investments. I don't want to go over the figures again, but Kristy has mentioned all the figures. She has mentioned the fields in which Taiwanese investment is taking place. Of course, every now and then one gets puzzling news items. She mentioned amongst the most famous firms with investments in India, the famous Foxconn, which, as she pointed out, is the world's largest manufacturer, contract manufacturer, whatever. But also, it is really is a huge company, and when the head of that company says that they will be investing $5 billion in India, that is credibility. People take it seriously. But as far as I can make out from the latest figures that I've seen, not much progress has taken place. And it is possible that problem lies at both ends. Returning to NSP, whilst we mentioned that there was first a Go South policy, it does seem that President Tsai Ing-wen, with her new Southbound policy, is more comprehensive more comprehensive. It seems to cover a wider range. It seems to have a wider vision. And also from, as Kristy has mentioned, it seems that Taiwanese government has put in many more resources into this policy than perhaps had been done earlier. What one particularly it's once again taking on from what Kristy is saying, there's so many possibilities, so much potential. I mean, take for instance something which also, when I was there, very exciting in terms of long-term potential was cooperation in the field of science and technology. One of my most memorable afternoons in the course of my diplomatic career was lunch hosted by Taiwan's one and only Nobel Prize winner, Mr. Li Guanze, a famous chemist. And I sort of, since I had really begun with practically zero database, there was a lot of information which I was gathering by the day, and here for the first time I discovered, and he mentioned, and he showed there were more than 20 Indian postdoctoral assistants which he had, and of whom he spoke, with great admiration and pride. Of course, I had no idea. So this, and of course, it's also when one looks at the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Center, which is the equivalent, the two offices have these names. Our office in Taiwan is the colorful name of India-Taipei Association, and our head operates as Director General India-Taipei Association. And one of my successors is we were Director Generals of ITA, which occasionally used to cause confusion. But anyway, the website of TECC here, I was very impressed to see the progress which seems to be taking place in the field of cooperation, science and technology. The very wide range of agreements have been signed. Very large number of collaborative projects seem to be already in operation, and there are several apart from the areas which Kristy mentioned. One should imagine that with the high, so much happening in both Taiwan and India, there is great opportunity. Say, for instance, I would imagine in places things like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and so on. I agree also with Kristy that there is such tremendous potential as far as education is concerned. And it is my, of course, only hope is that, this doesn't get restricted to learning Mandarin in Taiwan. Important though that is, but there's so much. I mean, once again, during my brief stay in Taiwan, I visited many universities and was invariably impressed with the high quality in practically every department there. So apart from the technology areas, obviously common sense suggests that one of the areas in which there is so much for us to learn from our Taiwanese counterparts is in terms of China watching, quote unquote. Obviously, their study of what happens in the mainland is just amazing. They, in a sense, you might say, given the kind of challenges which PRC presents to Taiwan, this is not surprising. So the range of scholarship in universities and think tanks just extraordinary. And naturally, as far as mentioning the people-to-people exchanges, they're growing. It'll perhaps take some more time but I'm not surprised that India does not really compare with the NSP countries which are in the neighborhood of Taiwan, the ASEAN countries. It is much easier. You might say the cultural gap is smaller for a variety of reasons, but I'm sure tourism will gradually rise between the two countries. One of the, of course, one is often, one speaks of the fact that both India and Taiwan are democracies. And in one area, this is a substantial asset, that because of this, when Indians go to Taiwan, in so many ways, they're more comfortable. They don't have to look around. But this should particularly be important in intellectual exchanges. One of the things which I find the literature on NSP, which I find very welcome, is that one of the objectives mentioned in this literature is to promote peace in the region. And this certainly, so long as one keeps that in mind, then one will sort of resist the temptation of politicizing the exchanges between India and Taiwan. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I have to say, and I would now like to turn to my colleagues. I've been told that the program which you have there has been switched around, and Bonnie Glase will be the next speaker. Bonnie.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the Institute for Chinese Studies. Is this one better? I believe that one was there. Okay. And the India International Center, thank you all for coming today. You probably have one question on your mind, that is, what are Americans doing in Delhi talking about Taiwan's new southbound policy? So I think that Ambassador Derek Mitchel and I will try to answer that question and give you our own personal perspectives. At the Center for Strategic and International Studies, I've been running a project the last few years doing research on the new southbound policy.
I'm going to be very rude and interrupt you. I failed in my duty. I haven't introduced you. Sometimes I introduce all the speakers right in the beginning, but this time I thought I'd do that before each speaker and failed. She is Senior Advisor for Asia and the Director of the very interestingly named China Power Project at CSIS, where she works on issues related to Asia-Pacific security with a focus on Chinese foreign and security policy. She has worked for more than 3 decades at the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and U.S. policy. She has served as consultant for various government offices, including the Departments of Defense and State. I'll skip the rest of it. I think you have it all. But I'm just going through the formality. But they have all got you, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
But my apologies for interrupting.
No worries. No worries. So from the perspective of just my personal view and the project that we've been doing, Taiwan is very much an important player, an important actor in the Indo-Pacific region. It is facing a lot of pressure from China, diplomatically, militarily, and even to some extent economically. I believe that the isolation of Taiwan in this region is very much detrimental to peace and stability. And so I see the new southbound policy as really aimed at more closely integrating Taiwan with countries in this region, and therefore I think it is beneficial for not just for Taiwan, but also for the United States and its many partners. And particularly countries that are like-minded, that share similar values and have similar principles on which we are pursuing our respective strategies toward the region. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and how that is evolving, and how I see the new southbound policy is intersecting with some of the objectives that the United States is trying to achieve. So what we are calling our free and open Indo-Pacific strategy having adopted or stolen this name from the Japanese, is, from my perspective, still in evolution. You know, President Trump was in Da Nang. He articulated this strategy last November at APEC. We had the National Security Strategy the following month, which had a few pages on the Indo-Pacific strategy. And then we've had, of course, our Secretary of Defense Mattis at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which of course was keynoted by Prime Minister Modi, elaborated on this strategy a bit. But the formulation stage, I think, is pretty much complete. It's now entered implementation, and there is, in fact, an implementation plan. And I think you'll be hearing more from the Trump administration going forward. And of course, what the U.S. has done is to set out a vision for the region that is based on, as I said, principles that I think are really very widely shared in this region. So if you look at some of the documents, for example, Secretary Mattis' speech, he talks about respect for sovereignty and independence of every nation, regardless of its size, freedom for all nations to transit international waters and airspace, peaceful resolution of disputes without pressure or coercion, adherence to international rules and norms, and free, fair, and reciprocal trade. And if you look at Prime Minister Modi's speech, I think you can find all of these elements also in the speech that he gave at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Of course, Prime Minister Modi also emphasized that the region should not just be free and open, but should also be inclusive. And I think that from the U.S. perspective, it is also inclusive. It has ASEAN as its center. And I think Prime Minister Modi also rightly emphasized connectivity, which the United States is also paying attention to. So the U.S. does not see this strategy as a club that we are asking countries to sign up to. My friends from Taiwan often ask me, what is our role in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy? So the U.S. is not assigning roles to countries, but we hope that we can collaborate with countries that share some of these aspects of our vision and have the same principles. And so I think, of course, there's many countries in this region that have their own strategies, and Japan has its free and open Indo-Pacific, and South Korea has the new Southern Policy. Indonesia has talked about for a couple of years the global maritime fulcrum. Australia issued last year a foreign policy white paper, also lays out its vision for the Indo-Pacific, and just recently New Zealand actually released a new strategic defense policy statement. They're still talking about the Asia-Pacific, but once again, sort of similar principles. And India, last but not least, of course, the Act East policy. And so I see a lot of convergence between the principles of many of these countries that they have articulated. And so the new Southbound Policy stems from that, I think. It's a desire by Tsai Ing-wen to prevent Taiwan from being isolated and to be more integrated into this region. And when I asked her myself, how would you describe the objectives of the new Southbound Policy? She said to me, we want to make friends. And maybe at its base, that is ultimately what Taiwan really wants to do. Of course, we all talk about the Quad with India, Australia, the United States, and Japan. But the Quad should not be conflated with the Indo-Pacific strategy. We think both are important, but when Derek and I just came from Manila, and before that Jakarta, so we are talking about how we set in the region, and there are people in Southeast Asia, I think, that are worried that the United States and India and Japan and Australia will pay more attention to what those four countries are doing rather than the rest of the region. But I think, as Prime Minister Modi emphasized, and also Secretary of Defense Mattis, we see that ASEAN remains central and very important to this region. So the U.S. hopes to partner with as many countries as possible who share our principles. strengthen ASEAN, bolster APEC, enhance maritime capacity. There's a large number of things that we can do together. It goes without saying this is not an anti-China policy. And again, just to quote Secretary Mattis, he said at the Shangri-La Dialogue that cooperation with China is welcome wherever possible. But that said, I think China's vision for the region will not necessarily completely converge with that of the US, with India. So we should work together where we can, but there may be differences that we have. So Taiwan's new Southbound Policy, again, Tsai Ing-wen really has developed this herself. It's her flagship foreign policy strategy, and she pays a lot of attention to it personally. She has instructed very key people in her administration to ensure that it is implemented, and they've been working on it now for a couple of years, but it's still to some extent in its early phases. I think that importantly, Taiwan is not seeking to provoke China. This is consistent with Tsai Ing-wen's policy of preserving the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. Indeed, if it were in any way aimed at provoking China, I don't think that the United States would support it, because we don't want to see increased tensions in the Taiwan Strait. So essentially, we think that Taiwan's democracy depends on sustaining its economic prosperity and connectivity with the region and the rest of the world, and that's what the new Southbound Policy is aimed at achieving. So Taiwan can be perhaps one of our partners in this region. I hope a partner of India and of the other members or the other target countries of the new Southbound Policy. We can partner to strengthen the rules-based fabric of this region. And as the ambassador articulated, and Kristy Tsun-Tzu Hsu as well, Taiwan has an extraordinary amount of expertise and also the will to participate in this region to promote a free and open, secure, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. And there's a long list of areas where Taiwan really excels that many countries in this region can benefit from, including fighting corruption, protecting intellectual property. Taiwan's healthcare system is among the best in the world, increasing agricultural output, moving up to higher value-added industries, promoting women entrepreneurship, strengthening e-commerce, improving waste management, building smart cities. The list is really is very long, and these are areas in which I think Taiwan can work with countries in the region. So in closing, I would say that like-minded countries can contribute to the preservation, the strengthening of the rules-based order in this region. Every country has a role to play, and indeed a responsibility. So I would say that Taiwan is no exception, that it should not be excluded, and we should take the opportunities and seize them to ensure that Taiwan is more closely integrated in this region and plays a role to enhance security and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for lucid and I would say somewhat briefer than I hoped and expected, but still really answered the question which was in the minds of a lot of us, including me, as to why. And you have given us a very clear answer to that, and also a very clear presentation of the Trump administration's policies with something which keeps puzzling people. But thank you very much. And now I turn to Ambassador Derek Mitchel. He is the incoming president of the National Democratic Institute. He pointed out this will come that this will be something happening in September. Yeah. And he's senior advisor to the Asia program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which if you look at the website of both these organizations, you'll find what useful and interesting work these two organizations are doing. And he has worked in the office of the Secretary of Defense, overseeing the Defense Department's security policy, Northeast, Southeast, South, and Central Asia. And he is inviting us to speak on U.S. interest in Taiwan's new Southbound Policy, and whatever else.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and good to see many old friends here in Delhi I didn't expect to see, so wonderful to reacquaint myself. The ambassador reminded me when I arrived that we had met and did a conference together in Washington about 10 years ago. And that was a time 10, 15 years ago when U.S.-India relations and think tanks were at a very early stage, and particularly thinking about how the U.S. and India think about East Asia was at not even a nascent stage. It wasn't thought about at all. In fact, I tend to think I might have been the first one to do it. I think in 2003 or 2004, right? I think it was in this building. Before people were thinking about India as part of the, quote, East Asia, at least in the American mindset. So I'm very pleased to be back. I'm very pleased that a lot has changed over the past 15 years, and that we can talk about Asia in this regional context with distinguished people around this table. You'll see outside, maybe some of you got the report that we did about new Southbound Policy through CSIS. I used to work at CSIS. That gives an overview, and I think Bonnie, if you think Bonnie was brief, I will be briefer, because Bonnie really covered very comprehensively the topic of U.S. interests and U.S. perspectives here. But one of the reasons we are here is because the new Southbound Policy is really not very well understood. And we did that report, and then we did a rollout in Washington to a clientele in Washington that didn't know much about it. And then realized afterwards we shouldn't be talking about this in Washington. We should be thinking about it, talking about it with folks in the region. It's really more about the region than it is about Washington. But as you see in the report, this really does overlap, and as Bonnie suggested, it does overlap with American interest. Just as we discussed 10 years ago, the U.S. and India have a lot of common interest. The whole concept of Indo-Pacific suggests that we should break down some of the old barriers and start thinking about how we can work together, think together, act together, otherwise do things together that support regional security, regional development, regional peace, all the things that work to our mutual benefit. So really we're looking at this whole initiative through that lens. And we should be thinking about it as in our mutual interest, both for domestic reasons of U.S.-India, which I know took a major hit last week when we didn't have a 2+2 we were supposed to have. The U.S.-India relationship really does matter greatly, tremendously, and we're only developing that relationship. But we should be thinking about broad issues. And this is a broad issue. And I am afraid, just like in Washington or anywhere in the region, that it is inevitably seen through a prism. And that prism is China. Because China, when the word Taiwan is mentioned, China will impose itself and say this is about us. And therefore we have a say, or they will make difficulty for countries in anything regarding Taiwan. But as Bonnie suggests, Taiwan is not just a political issue. It is 23 million people who have been remarkably successful in developing a democracy at home, developing tremendous capabilities in innovation, and ICT, and entrepreneurship, and empowerment of women, all kinds of things. Cutting edge on things like smart cities, cutting edge on all kinds of things that have very practical value. And what the new Southbound Policy is about, certainly it is about making friends. It certainly has that quasi-political element of avoiding isolation, avoiding being ignored, certainly, but also of making a practical contribution to the region and to the well-being of the region. And Bonnie mentioned the speech by Prime Minister Modi at Shangri-La, which was a remarkable, really eloquent speech. I think made a major impression on people. And just to quote some of it that he mentioned, he talks about the destinies of those of us who live in the region are linked. We are being called to rise above divisions and competition to work together. India's vision for the Indo-Pacific region is a positive one. It requires us to evolve through dialogue, a common rules-based order, and he concludes, one of the conclusions, we choose the side of principles and values of peace and progress, not one side of a divide or the other. And in fact, I think that's how we're looking at this. We're looking at this as here's successful, here's something that's being offered by people that have much to offer. I think it should be thought of in those terms, and it needs to be introduced, I think, smartly and thoughtfully to the region, and it's something that the U.S. should be thinking about with its partners. So, in the end, this is a very practical, not political initiative. I think Taiwan would be foolish to make this a political matter, understanding the difficulties that countries have. There are certain lines and red lines beyond which it would not be helpful. But Taiwan then brings certain values to the table, certain methods, certain ways that I think work in concert with the people of the Indo-Pacific region. So really, that's all I want to be saying as a general case, and I think now we can have a conversation about it. So thank you very much.
In all my previous experiences in the chair, I've had to do to the speakers to draw their attention to the fact that they've overstepped their time limit. But thank you very much for sort of this as I would expect from a diplomat, this emphasis on mutual interest. This very careful, both Bonnie and he have brought out that this really would make no sense for Taiwan to be provoking PRC or any of us being part of any partnership which is seen as provoking PRC.